So that story must be a Sunday school teacher's dream. It's dramatic, it's suspenseful, and it's short. And I'm sure that's a big plus with the younger set. And it's one of the few Bible stories where a young person has the starring role. Now, I heard that story in Sunday school when I was growing up. And I also heard the lessons I was supposed to get from it. You know, lessons about going to church because Samuel was in church in the temple when it happened, obeying my elders because Samuel did what Eli told him to do, and opening my heart to God. But you know, those lessons didn't quite take because, well, things like that don't happen, thought my 8-year-old omniscient self. Well, now I'm not so sure. I spent 30 plus years in an evangelical church. And as I was getting more progressive, the church was going the other way. I loved the people, I loved my role, and I didn't want to leave. But I knew the day was coming, and so I was keeping my eyes and my ears open. George and I were in Boston with our son, Nick. You know, New England is the heart of the congregational branch of the UCC. You knew that, right? And today, 20% of UCCers live in those 6 little states. But anyway, we were wandering around in downtown Boston, and we were looking at the churches. They charged admission. But there was one that didn't, one that was open to anyone, and it was, you guessed it, it was the UCC, absolutely, whoever you are and wherever you are. So we wandered in. I don't know what I was looking for. I knew that my favorite theologian was a UCCer, and I was reading a book on church growth written by a UCCer, and maybe I wanted to see why these people that I respected so much were part of this particular denomination. Plus, I'd been raised UCC. I'd gone to a predominantly UCC seminary, so maybe I wanted to see what the denomination was like decades later. Or maybe I just wanted to be in church. I don't know. But as we walked in, I saw a banner, and it said, "God is still speaking." And I thought, the UCC, this could be home. So our story today begins in the days when the judges ruled Israel. And it was a pretty rough time. The writer of the book of Judges kept saying over and over, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And you can just imagine what some of them thought was right. There was some really awful stuff going on. So we're about 1,100 years before Jesus, and we're in what is today Israel. And there was a woman, her name was Hannah, who couldn't get pregnant. She made a deal with God. Give me a child, and of course it had to be a male child, and I'll give that child back to you. God arranged a baby. So Hannah named the baby Samuel, and keeping up with her end of the bargain, she sent little Samuel to live with Eli the priest. So Samuel was living at the shrine in a place called Shiloh. Now, this was not the best of times. Israel was a marginal community, primarily because of their very hostile, aggressive neighbors, the Philistines. Perhaps you've heard of them. And it wasn't only external threats. Israel was politically unstable, was economically disadvantaged, and there was also an ethical and theological dimension to Israel's trouble. The end of the book of Judges shows Israel as a community that was in total moral chaos. They were engaged in brutality and corrupt religious practices and injustice. So our reading, Samuel was being mentored by and parented by Eli the priest. And the writer tells us that God's word was rare, so what was going to happen wouldn't be routine. Now, at this point, we might want to be skeptical. Was the word of the Lord actually rare, as in not occurring, or did it seem to be rare because nobody was listening? Now, it's true that Eli was not the priest that he used to be, and his sons were scumbags, but is it really likely that God was silent? And the text goes on to say that Eli's eyes were weak and he couldn't see. This is sometimes interpreted as a metaphor for Israel's spiritual blindness. Now, we got to be careful here. People with disabilities often get portrayed in a less than positive light in biblical interpretations. So we want to look at the text and see what it says. And it doesn't say anything about there being anything spiritually or morally deficient about Eli's inability to see. His eyes didn't work. That's all. So the chest that Samuel slept beside was the Ark of the Covenant. This was the legendary throne of the invisible king, Yahweh, the God of Israel. The people carried it into battle at the head of their armies. It was said to contain all the relics of Israel's history. It had a jar of manna. It had Aaron's rod that had sprouted almonds. And it had the Ten Commandments. So sleeping next to this thing had to be kind of like sleeping in a graveyard, or I don't know, maybe under a volcano. And then came the repeated attempts of God to get Samuel's attention. God is persistent. So Samuel assumed, like we saw, that it was Eli calling because no one else was there. So Eli sent him back, poor confused kid, and it happened a third time. What in the world? What's going on here? Back to Eli. Fortunately, Eli finally figured out what was going on, and he told Samuel how to respond. Back to bed again, and sure enough, a fourth time. Samuel, Samuel. And when God called this time, Samuel spoke those classic words, "Speak, your servant is listening." The Hebrew word translated listen also means hear, and it means obey. If you didn't obey, you weren't listening. So what? So why does Samuel even matter? Well, first, Samuel was the last of the judges. People went to him from all around, all the neighboring villages, and he would explain to them what was good and what was wise, and his word, when he did that, was law. Second, Samuel was the kingmaker. He anointed Saul and then David to be kings. And third, he was the first of a long line of prophets. And he was followed by Elijah and Elisha and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Amos and Joel and Ezekiel and John the Baptist and Jesus, all of whom had the courage to speak to anybody, including the religious leaders and the kings, when they saw injustice. And it cost all of them. Samuel set in motion events that were going to neutralize the Philistines, give Israel some internal stability, and temper some of the serious injustices and atrocities. According to the hierarchies of the day, the people who should have heard God's voice, though, were Eli and his sons. They were the authorities. They were the insiders. But God chose Samuel, a kid who wasn't bound by the ambitious interests of his elders, and a kid who was open to delivering a message that was going to upend the very institution that supported him and benefited him. Way to go, Samuel, yes. But let's not forget that while Samuel heard God's voice, he didn't recognize it. And he didn't know how to respond to it. Only when Eli told him the right words to say could Samuel answer God's call. Now, Eli was a little slow. God had to call Samuel 3 times before Eli remembered that, yes, God really does do this kind of stuff. Still, Eli had spent his whole life in God's service. He was living near the ark. He was praying. He was worshiping. And he's the one that realized what Samuel was hearing. Tell the Lord, speak, for your servant's listening. So communication with God isn't only a matter of personal receptivity, like Samuel, but it's also about training and discipline. It's about learned skills and practices that are faithfully performed, like Eli. So now what? Our story today confronts us with a reality that spirituality is something we have to work at. It doesn't just come naturally. It's got to be cultivated. Samuel got the call, but he didn't know what it was. Only Eli, with his years of spiritual discipline, knew. Now, we're not much into cultivating things unless it's tomatoes. We'd rather just order something on the internet and have it show up the next day. Instant spirituality, right? Press the button, and I got God. But if we want to experience God's presence and God's guidance, we are going to have to be intentional about paying attention to the many, many ways that God speaks. If we're going to be in line with God's work in the world, we're going to have to cultivate a sense of God's presence. And then we're going to have to listen/obey. Because as our UCC slogan reminds us, God is still speaking. Now, for some people here in this room today, the traditional ways of listening, studying the Bible, praying, listening to sermons, these will work fine. For other people, it's going to take different practices, and there are lots of them. And we have some great people in our congregation who are experts and can give you places to start. For some non-traditional ways to listen for God's voice, talk to Lauren Jewett. I don't see Lauren. Talk to Catherine Lehman, who is out of town, or talk to Jennifer Godo. I know, right there, Jennifer Godo. And the time spent listening is worth it, and it's essential if we want to be doing God's work in the world. God still speaks, but do we listen? The third chapter of 1 Samuel has two purposes. The first is to promote the legitimacy of Samuel as a leader, and we've seen that. The story of Samuel's call is innocent, and it's idyllic, and it's perfect for little kids and for people who want a safe religion. What the voice of God said to Samuel is less discussed in Sunday school or anywhere else. But the story has that second purpose, and that's to discredit the failed leadership of the house of Eli. So now what? Well, now we're going to call our readers back up here to finish the story.
The Lord said to Samuel, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear it tingle. On that day, I will bring to pass against Eli everything I said about his household, every last bit of it. I told him that I would punish his family forever because of the wrongdoing he knew about, how his sons were cursing God, but he wouldn't stop them. Because of that, I swore about Eli's household that his family's wrongdoing will never be reconciled by sacrifice or by offering.
Samuel lay there until morning, then opened the doors of the Lord's house. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel, saying, Samuel, my son, I'm here. Samuel said, What did he say to you? Eli asked. Don't hide anything from me. May God deal harshly with you, and worse still if you hide from me a single word from everything he said to you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. He was the Lord. Eli said, He will do as he pleases. So Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him, not allowing any of his words to fail. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was trustworthy as the Lord's prophet. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh through the Lord's own word.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. And my notes are messed up. So, okay, here we go. Let's look at this. So Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they were stealing the offerings and they were sleeping with the woman who attended the shrine. God had already sent a messenger to warn Eli about the antics of his sons. Eli had made a feeble speech to them, and that was it. So God was just furious. And the message was really hard. The house of Eli had been promised priestly authority forever. Now that same house was going to be punished forever. The judgment was going to be so hard that the ears of those who heard it would tingle. Now, tingling ears isn't like tickling ears. Tingling is what your ears do when you get really bad news. This was going to be some pretty serious divine action. God's verdict was as sure as it was devastating. There was no appeal. There was no recourse. Now, this isn't the way that God usually operates, but that's how God was operating here. When it comes to God, there is no formula. There is no domestication. Our God is wild and untamable. And with that final rage echoing in the air, the voice stopped. And there was Samuel. What was he going to do? Announce to the man who'd raised him, that old frail Eli, that his day was past, that he and his house, his dynasty, were going to be annihilated by a furious God? This was Samuel's prophetic call. And it's no wonder that later prophets looked for a way to get out of it. Boy, don't give me that call. What Samuel was called to do was not easy. But he couldn't lie there forever. He had to get up, and he had to go and confront Eli. Now, he'd probably been aware, young as he was, that there was something weird going on with Hophni and Phinehas. Since Eli had been Samuel's mentor and guide and father figure, giving him this news was going to be really, really gut-wrenching. And remember that Samuel was just a kid, and he tried to dodge it, but Eli was pretty sure that God hadn't come to Samuel in the middle of the night to do karaoke. So he was going to have to tell him, and he insisted. And Samuel did it. And when Eli heard the message, he was a model of piety, and he said, "He's the Lord. He will do as he pleases." So what? This week, people all around the world honor America's great civil rights leader and prophet, Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was an outsider, so he was perfectly positioned to speak truth to power. Like the adult Samuel, like Isaiah, like Jeremiah, like Jesus. Dr. King was willing to make his listeners uncomfortable, even at great cost to himself. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." He was a pastor. He was a civil rights activist. He was a gifted speaker. I have a dream. But he was so much more. He really cared about the racially and the socioeconomically oppressed people who suffered under the modern-day pharaohs and emperors. And this caring led him to fight for human rights. Through nonviolent resistance, he fought for racial justice for those that were considered to be so subhuman that they could be fire hosed down in the street by police. He called for peace and an end to the Vietnam War. He fought for economic justice, working and dying on behalf of the poor. But what gets much less attention is his spiritual foundation. One night in January 1956, during the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King got a threatening phone call. Afterwards, he couldn't sleep. He was at a breaking point. He was exhausted. He was about to give up. And he later reported that he prayed. And this is what he said: "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." And then he said he could, and I quote, "hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, 'Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever. His fears calmed because he heard God speak. And he heard because he was listening. Is there a downside to listening? Oh, yeah. Listening to God certainly has dangers attached to it. Without this reassurance from God, a frightened Dr. King could have packed up his family, moved away, relocated to a safer place, and lived a long, secure, peaceful life with his family and friends. Pastor a little church somewhere in upstate New York or Galt. But because he heard from God, he stayed and fought. And it would cost him his life. Listening can be costly. As a young boy, Samuel had the courage to tell the truth to a leader of the Israelite community. The essence of a prophet. A prophet, Samuel, Dr. King, tells the truth to anybody in power who leads in a way that's contrary to the justice that God requires. This is what a prophet does. Now, this isn't criticizing your next-door neighbor for drinking too much. This isn't hassling your nephew about his sex life. A prophet tells the truth about societal greed and corruption and injustice. Again, a prophet speaks truth to power. Through Samuel, God was about to do something new, but it wouldn't be a grand religious act. It was an invitation to a fresh and dangerous social beginning. To act justly in the world means to follow God's ongoing activity in the world, but to know what God's doing, one has to listen. And Samuel was going to be part of that beginning. Parkside, God is giving us that same challenge. We can make, and we are making, a difference in our world. But we have to listen, and I think that action by the council the other night was definitely group corporate listening. How do we do that? With practice. We can hear God's voice in lots of different ways. Those traditional practices or the non-traditional ones. But it only happens when we turn off all those other channels that are blaring in our brains. And we finally focus. Repeatedly. Over and over. And we practice until it becomes second nature to us to listen. Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening. Listening's time. It's concentration. Listening is focusing on what God is saying to us now, here, today. Now, Samuel couldn't listen corporately because there was no one to listen with. He was it. But that's not so for us. We have each other. And we need to listen corporately as well. There's decisions ahead. What are we going to do in 2024? What are our priorities going to be? Who will Parkside be in 2024? And we're deciding those things right now. We're listening for God's guidance. Let's learn to listen to this together. Join one of our teams. Volunteer to work and listen with other Parksiders. Be part of the listening and the implementing. You want to? Want to? Talk to one of the team leaders. Team leaders, stand up. Stand up. We're missing, where's Lori? Okay, and Lori Sugars, there you are. Okay, these are our team leaders. You want to get involved, talk to them. Or talk to a member of the discipleship team. Stand up. Michael, me, let's see, Sharon Powers, James Walsh, and Aritz Cardenas. These are the people to talk to if you want to get involved. And it will be so rewarding. You can sit down. I won't make you stand there forever. Together, we have to cultivate those listening skills, those obeying skills. Because Parkside, God is still speaking.